What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. It's a brand new meta. Let's take a look at some decks that are succeeding in this weird and awkward and new environment. One of the biggest takeaways of the patch for me was that with Galacta getting nerfed, the largest sort of point generic type of deck got a little bit smaller. Galacta was a big part of a lot of different point packages, which means that now it's time to look at her contemporaries and see which of them was the closest behind her in terms of replacing her value. I'll say this much. This deck was already maybe my best deck this season. I had about a 66% win rate over about 60 games. It felt very solid. Basically as good as any deck I've played since the release day of Kid Omega. And a lot of that is down to the fact that it had a lot of point potential while not investing too highly in that point potential and still maintaining all sorts of answers to everything everyone is going to be doing. Whether your opponent is out there playing Thanos, you can Killmonger them. If they're playing Move Bounce, you can Killmonger and Shadow King them. If they're playing ongoing cards, you can Enchantress them. And basically everyone is playing something large enough to Shang-Chi. But between the combination of Gwenpool, Mysterio, and Hitmonkey, you can also win games in which all of your tech cards are not necessarily always going to be doing what you need them to do. This deck can output large numbers of points in general, and that allows it to be a successful deck both in and outside the context of this metagame, which is to say, this deck was already amazing for me. Only thing that happened to it was cards it didn't run got nerfed. That's a really big deal. This was already a deck that wasn't playing Red Guardian. This was already a deck that wasn't playing Galacta. A bunch of other decks in a similar space, i.e. tech decks that are investing in limited amounts of points packages with a lot of tech, got hit. This didn't. Keep an eye on it. The Misery buff has people revisiting the Thor's deck. The Thor's deck, of course, plays very similarly to the Sarah deck we just saw, but again, it's using a different sort of points package. This is, again, a deck in the same space, though. It's a deck that looks to be a points and interaction deck. Good points and good tech. What Misery is doing here is being a very large body in addition to doubling up on the honor reveals of Thor's Hammer and of Stormbreaker. So we have a double Mjolnir, a double Stormbreaker on the table, and then you also have the potential to do like Mjolnir, Stormbreaker, and a tech card later in the game. That is the ethos of a deck like this. A lot of the time, your best final turn is going to be Shadow King alongside a Misery with two hammers. That's the kind of thing that can be nearly unbeatable in these sort of mid-rangey points and tech type games if you have the ability to not have priority. And that is a very powerful thing to be. Of the decks that are sort of shaped like this, there are plenty of them. We've talked ad nauseum about the points and tech archetypes recently. This is one that I think has gone under the radar for a while, and Misery gaining a point of power is the kind of thing that really does matter to it because of just how often a deck like this isn't winning by a billion Thor points, but is in fact sort of nickel and diming its wins out of nowhere, and that 1 point is really impactful. Of course, we also have the Misery Hood game plan. I would expect to see a lot of that across a wide amount of different things. This is, of course, a deck that is flexible. More than anything, this deck does not actually have a coherent set game plan. You might think it's the right thing to do to just be like, I'm going to do my Thor thing and then that's going to win. It's not always true. Some of the time you're going to have to abandon the Thor thing, become a Demons and Tech deck, and then if you happen to draw one of the Thor hammers, great. It's day one of a new metagame. Do you know where your Mobius M. Mobius is? Because if it's not in your deck, it's gonna be a deck that probably loses to Mr. Negative. One of the really cool things that I think Mr. Negative does do is accelerate metagames. If you are in an early metagame, you can be fairly sure that people are experimenting. We just talked about a Thor's deck, for God's sake. you know that people are going to be messing around with some things that maybe aren't necessarily optimal and definitely aren't necessarily tech to deal with this, which has some very specific answers. And I think this is a crucial dynamic to note, one of the major reasons this happens is because people are experimenting with large packages at the beginning of new metagames because they want to figure out where the power is. And as you're experimenting with large packages, you end up losing the ability to put tech in. As I say this, I realize there are people probably giggling at the large packages phrasing. If that's you, buckle up, we're going to keep talking like that. This is a deck that is meant to punish things that are unoptimized. Previously, that role was held largely by, Thanos RSM, but that got a big kick in the face with the nerf to Thanos, or maybe the change to Thanos, we'll call it. So this is now the deck that is, it's day one, I am going to be stress testing your ability to do anything weird. Because when I think about decks in Marvel Snap, combo decks, as it were, are defined to me not by their own points output, but by their lack of interaction. By the lack of space, because they devoted so many of their cards to their proactive game plan, to their point creation, that they have none to be reactive with. And Mr. Negative just goes over the top of every single one of those decks that are doing that. That's sort of the role Mr. Negative has, which makes it a very solid choice in a metagame like this. Everything I said about Mr. Negative also applies to Move Bounce. Very solid deck. It is a little bit closer to the ground than a good Mr. Negative draw, but it's also a little bit more consistent in terms of output than a close Mr. Negative draw. If I were to sort of draw a continuum of like consistency versus points output, this would be kind of in the middle between Mr. Negative and normal bounce. That's sort of how I look at these decks. And so I think that Move Bounce's consistency means that it merits a spot on a list like this, obviously. But I also think that the fact that there are multiple people, including myself, doing like this Invisible Woman Killmonger stuff, Invisible Woman Shang-Chi, Invisible Woman and Shadow King, there's a weirdly decently large amount of stuff that actually does interact with Move Bounce for basically no reason other than luck. Like, there's not anything that says people should be doing this, but I've been doing it and a couple other people have been doing it, so it's around and you have to kind of account for it. And that is sort of a knock on this compared to Mr. Negative if you are going to be one of those decks that is just asking people, do you have the answer to me? Normally, it's better to ask for like a multi-card answer like Killmonger, Invisible Woman. Right now, people are actually playing that, and I've seen more of that than I have of Mobius. Another sort of early metagame symptom here, like we see this Zorn deck, which is something that I don't exactly know who to credit with, but people have been sort of iterating on it ever since Zorn's release. It looks a lot like the Husky Puppies list from way back then. But this is another sort of early meta thing, right? If people are going to be experimenting and trying to figure out what's good, then it's probably the best time possible to just drop the Infinite on their faces. It's the same ethos as any of the combo decks here. It's just I think that long term, those two combo decks we just talked about are going to outcompete this one. But right now might be one of the only times you're going to see this deck being not only legitimately playable, but actively good. Like I said, we've talked about a lot of different situations wherein, people are relying on different tech cards. This deck is running straight forward into a Shang-Chi, but it's saying, look, you cannot Shang-Chi me everywhere. You just can't do it. And if you can't Shang-Chi me everywhere, you're going to have to deal with the numbers I'm putting on the board. And if you can't deal with the numbers I'm putting on the board and you can't Shang-Chi me everywhere, you're probably losing the game. This deck also weaponizes uncertainty in really powerful ways. Like, a movable Red Wing on the final turn of the game is so scary because you don't know how big it is. And I realize it's going to be large, but not knowing if it's like 10 or 20 really matters. And not knowing if they're going to move the Red Wing or move some other big guy and try to just juke you out entirely really matters. All of the jukes in this deck mean that it's not necessarily like the very high skill cap, because I do think at the highest level of the game, it just does kind of go back to being 50-50s. But you're never really out of it unless you're running up against one of those combo decks. That's sort of the feeling I get with one of these decks. It's like, unless you're getting purely outpowered, you are just not really ever out of a game. If you're playing against a mid-range deck, you're only ever going to be like 50% to win. Like, that's the worst you're ever going to be at. That's a good value proposition. As Galacta has fallen, we have to give some more credit to the other mid-range shells that were succeeding when she was still good. This is, of course, one of those mid-range shells. I believe this is Honifer's old list, roughly, of the Agamotto and Agamotto and Annihilus. There's too many A names in this game. Agamotto and Annihilus deck that is basically focused on maximizing the output of Werewolf by Night, having these uniquely powerful Sentry into Polymorph, Sentry into Annihilus turns, doing very strong things with the Hood. Just a classic, like, fair plus mid-range deck, where when I say fair plus, it's like, this does do unfair stuff. Sometimes they have 10 energy on turn 6. That's not particularly fair, but, like, this is a deck that is, again, it's fair plus. That's really sort of the idea here. Every good points in interaction deck is fair plus. What this deck lacks primarily is the top-end interaction. No Shang, no Ench, so what it's doing is adding up all of the smaller pieces into something that is bigger than the sum of the parts. That's sort of how this deck tends to play out. You're using pieces in combination with each other, your on reveals with Wolf, your semi-clog strategies with the arrows that you get from Kate Bishop, and your Merlin with whatever, he's sort of the glue guy here, your spells also semi-clog, all sorts of things that you can do with this deck if you are interested. A lot of varying and dynamic game plans. Basically the exact same metagame space as the Sarah deck, where it's just, we're already not a Galacta deck, so let's be a Gwenpool Mysterio deck. Gwenpool Mysterio Sasquatch, especially if there's buffs on the Mysterio, very reasonable point output. You play 4 cards on turn 5, you have a Sasquatch and one of the big tech cards, either Shang or Ench on 6, usually going to be enough to win you lanes, usually going to be enough to win you games. Really all I need to say about this one, just that, again, we're talking about mid-range shells rising up in the absence of Galacta. There are already so many of them that were at least kind of competitive in that spot now. And now we are really moving into seeing, like, this could be a Gwenpool type of meta. Like, this Gwenpool Mysterio stuff has taken an early lead. Not necessarily that it's all going to stay that way, but Gwenpool Mysterio stuff looking quite promising so far. A couple of just honorable mention decks played by high elo players that I know. This is, of course, an Eggy 1-2-1 deck. If you are looking into Dormammu, I've been messing around in a similar space with this, sort of combined more with the Sasquatch stuff from the last deck that we talked about. But I do think that it's probably worth investigating whether or not Mysterio Dormammu is like a very reasonable thing, because Mysterio solves a couple of problems for this deck. The first is it wants stuff on the board just generally. All of the spells require stuff on the board. The second is, like, you merge something that dies and then you still need 2 bodies. And it's kind of hard to actually get the 2 bodies. So using this old Death Bird strat, of course, we see the Death and the Bird in here as well, means that you're going to be reasonably able to just, like, dump some power on the board at some point towards the end of the game, maybe a 3-cost Death in the final Dormammu spell, all that kind of stuff. You're going to be in a lot of games. It's going to be pretty hard for people to predict your Dormammu because you're probably going to have a lot of lanes where it is legally possible for you to play your Dormammu, which is an advantage because a lot of the normal Dormammu decks end up in spots where it is very obvious where the Dormammu is going to go, and they just kind of have to eat the fact that it could get Cosmo'd or that the opponent could just abandon that lane, and so it's not actually really doing anything. Whole bunch of stuff. Just wanted to highlight this one for anyone who's still coping Dormammu. I think Dormammu Mysterio might have some legit legs to it in some form, and is probably worth investigating, at least in terms of optimizing the big bad orange man. Gamer put together an ongoing Thanos list, which looks to me like the early frontrunner for how we're going to have to play Thanos going forward. Ongoing Thanos strikes me as the much more powerful version of what everyone is trying to do, and this is largely because other versions of Thanos kind of count on having Thanos, right? Like, if you're playing the 10s version of Thanos, obviously you care a lot about being able to time stone a 10 down onto the board, right? Like, you care about the body. This is the deck that uses the stones as material the best. It uses it for filling up lanes, for your Dazzler, it uses them for ongoings, for Goliath, it uses them for all of this stuff, right? And so, it is the deck that was, and always has been, the least reliant on Thanos starting in your opening hand, which means that it is probably the one that is best set up to actually succeed in this metagame. Note that there's a really cool little astral projection in here, not sold on it. Honestly, I mean, if you know me, you know I'm thinking about replacing it with Kyera. Right now, the basic idea is just it's high rolling, though, right? Like, you get to just super high roll. Like, if you get the stones out of your hand, that's a Wiccan, that's a Spectrum, right? And you can play in such a way that, like, you can do that later in the game, depending on how things go. Just make sure the stones reveal after it if you're playing them on the same turn. Like, if you have one stone in hand and a Wiccan in hand, you can go, you know, face down this, it becomes Wiccan. and then like the stone draws and doesn't risk you drawing another stone and blowing up your astral. There's cool stuff here. I just think that, like, the astral projection's kind of like a bit of a gimmick right now. It is legitimately good when you can get it to do what it wants to do, which is like early Wiccan. That's super baller. It's like a super baller thing to do. I just think that, like, it's also like, early Wiccan, early Spectrum, both of those are really cool. They're just like very cool things to constantly be doing. There's no argument here. Astral projectioning either one of those is dope. Astral projectioning a stone kinda sucks in my opinion. Like, it's just not worth the 3. You would rather have basically any body because you care so much about having ongoing bodies on the board. Catch me probably trying to just like play Kyera instead, because I am worried about the mongers in a world where people are playing Dormammu stuff still. Another just absolute stat checker. Like, again, like a lot of it's. I think what's really funny about early metagames is there's people who want to experiment and like try to find out what the best mid-rangey decks are going to be and like try to play, I guess you'd call it real Marvel Snap. And then there's people who are just like, no, I don't want to do that at all. I want to punish you for doing that. And, Danish has always been one of those people. Here's where he's at on Hela. He noted that he didn't like Lockjaw in it just yet, but it's still worth experimenting with, presumably. There's going to be maybe some iteration on this, but this is still just a very solid list that is bent on beating mid-range decks. If anything, it got a little worse with the patch because of people potentially being more willing to be, Mr. Negative gamers or whatever that can actually match this on points. But it's doing kind of the same thing where it's like, look, if you aren't going to deal with me, I am going to have more points than you. I think it's sort of analogous to the Zorn Red Wing deck where we talked about, like, these are both decks that are just putting a couple of really big guys on the board, saying you can't Shang-Chi me everywhere. Here are my big guys. Go ahead and answer me if you can. And I think that's a fine place to be, especially early in the metagame. I do think that Hela is typically actually, weirdly for a deck like this, better in more defined metas, especially in mid-range metas. Hela always has been sort of the mid-range crusher, so it's not necessarily the most optimal thing to whip out early if you're running into those Mr. Negatives who are doing what I talked about earlier. But I do think it has plenty of just early game, I'm going to play the Infinite, deal with my Infinite, nice Gwenpool idiot, right? Like, there's plenty of that to go around. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.